So it's my pleasure to welcome David Prodger with the British Consul General in Miami. Mr. Prodger has served in a number of roles with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and in the private sector. Before taking his current post, David served as head of European Security Policy in FCO London, deputy head of mission and consul general at the British Embassy, Brussels, and head of the commercial team at the embassy in Buenos Aires. He's passionate about ensuring critical public infrastructures remain resilient to natural hazards. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tiffany. We've had a fascinating morning, but just to raise the energy levels, I want to talk about insurance. Actually, I want to talk about risk and how to make resilience affordable. So, being a Brit and coming from close to London, obviously everything comes back down to money. And it's one of the key conundrums that we're facing. How do policymakers not just make it affordable, but make it sustainable over the long term, and not just give our communities economic resilience, but combine that with real physical resilience as we go on. So what we've been doing as a consulate, partly by virtue of being based here right at the point of the spear when it comes to sea level rise and climate change, is we've been looking at across the spectrum at how do we identify and quantify the risks we're facing. How do we ascribe a value to that risk? In other words, the insurance bit. How do we mitigate that risk? So infrastructure. And then how do we finance that in a way which is affordable and equitable? Something that I face in my own household. I can't imagine how you do it at a city level. So firstly, a bit of a recap. Let's just see if we can get this going. Here we go. Oh no, sorry, gone backwards. Let's try again. Sorry about this. Let me just defeated by the technology again. My forward button doesn't seem to be working. Right, there we go. Okay. So this is just simply a chart of catastrophic events, and we're talking. When I talk about catastrophe, we're talking about catastrophic, predominantly weather-related events for the purposes of today. So last year was the most expensive year for natural catastrophes, whether that's hurricanes, whether that's earthquakes or floods or fires. We reckon it's over 200 billion at the moment, maybe 220 billion. Even before this, over the last 10 years, there had been $1.3 trillion of losses due to catastrophe, of which only 30% were insured. That doesn't include last year, but that's an indication of some of the numbers you can see about this and some of the impact of those events. Last November, the Congressional Budget Office did a report on the effects of climate change on coastal development and its implications for the federal budget. The CBO report does a couple of things that are notable. Firstly, it acknowledges the link between climate change and human activity, and then it evaluates the cost of inaction on two fronts. Climate-driven events, both chronic, like sea level rise, and catastrophic, like Irma, and directly man-made vulnerabilities, i.e. building where we shouldn't. And it estimates the cost of damage increasing by 1/3 along with government exposures, while the percentage of US population affected increasing 8-fold. It also highlights that federal spending as a percentage of total damage has increased from 17% in the recovery from Katrina in 2005 to 62% now. In other words, government exposure to catastrophic risk is getting greater as the problems get worse. So how do we confront that? As Mike Bloomberg says, you measure it, you manage it, and then you finance it. So it begins with the analysis, and every event is different, but we're learning with every event, and the modelling is actually now getting quite good. By the way, I make no apology for, you'll see lots of different logos on these slides. That's because none of them are mine. I've unashamedly poached them from companies we've been working with over the last couple of years on these kinds of issues. So RMS have got their big client conference here in Miami next week, where they will get risk modelers from around the world to talk about how you deal with these kinds of issues here in Miami, so they can apply those models all through the world. So you'll see that RMS modelling has been pretty good. And if you look at it compared to Irma last year, RMS were predicting, as Irma was coming through, that would incur losses in Puerto Rico of between about $15 and $30 billion. That's, you can say that's quite a wide margin, $15 billion margin. Some of the other modeling companies are saying, no, it's going to be 85. It's around about 25 at the moment. So the modeling is getting pretty good. The problem is that we are in unknown territory. So for those who don't know, this is called an exceedance probability curve. And I said I was going to, up the ante a bit, just as we get towards lunchtime. Basically, this is saying a likelihood of a catastrophic event against the damage. And what you want is you want to lower that curve to the bottom left as much as you can. But you'll see this is looking out to 2025, and this is looking at sea level rise and sea level rise plus coastal development. So the likelihood, a 1% probability, in other words, more or less a one in 100-year event, is going to cause $205 billion worth of damage. That's a lot of money by anybody's book. And we just don't know really how those patterns are going to develop in the future. So that's going to greatly complicate our response. So the question becomes, what's our tolerance of risk? And then how do we go about managing that? So getting back to the CBO study, and just to cheer you up, it also said that Florida's going to take 55% of all the hurricane damage. It said that damage is going to grow faster than GDP, and that 55% of that damage is due to increased coastal development. So, folks, we're doing all the right things. Its only conclusion could be that government needs to shift costs from the public sector to the private sector, because that would increase incentives to take action to mitigate, or should I say invest to mitigate. So if the public sector takes measures to limit its exposure, in other words, to take away that moral hazard where it's going to be the investor or the funder of last resort, then someone needs to fill that gap. Because we know the current situation, for example, with NFIP is unsustainable. 24 billion hole last year. Even when that was filled, that was more than taken by the payouts for Hurricane Harvey. So what do we need to do about it? Well, we know that resilience is a good thing. These figures you see down the left here come from various studies, but it's an Arup slide. Investing in resilience is good sense. It pays back between 4, 7, 10 times your investment, even 15 times your investment. So if government's going to lose, and government has to shift risk towards those that incur it, it follows, therefore, that government investment to reduce exposure is worthwhile as a wider catalyst for others to do likewise. But it's not all that straightforward. There are barriers, and there are quite significant barriers. And the key, therefore, is that last one, is how do you attract that individual and the private sector to do this investment? So we at the Consulate have been looking at how to do this with some of our British companies. And the reason we're doing that is because we're dealing with the same kind of issues in the UK. For example, in Cumbria, in the northwest of England, we've had 3 100-year floods since 2005. Poor planning by local councils had meant that more and more housing has been built on vulnerable floodplains. As I said, we're doing all the right things. We don't get hurricanes, we do get a lot of weather. So it's a big deal for us. But that said, we're well placed to tackle it. We've got companies who are experts in modelling. We're very good at financial risk, particularly having got through the lessons of the 1980s, which culminated with Hurricane Andrew here, which pretty much broke the back of the British insurance industry, but also transformed it into a sector that's probably the world's most analytically driven and liquid reinsurance markets now. On infrastructure, we have companies who are very, very entrepreneurial in the way they go about environmental design and designing with the flow rather than against it. And we've got a lot of smart capital. Just to give you an idea of how that works now, if you go back to 2005, that's Katrina, Wilma and Rita. 2011, which was the worst ever year up until last year, with over $120 billion worth of insured losses, or Superstorm Sandy in 2012, the markets dealt with those as routine events. They were capitalized well enough, they were reinsured well enough, and whilst they were tough years, they weren't causing existential crises within the reinsurance markets. At the same time, new products like insurance-linked securities, like catastrophe bonds, are really coming into play. FEMA placed $100 million worth of coverage. Last year, it paid back $1 billion in its first year because of Harvey. You know, that's good investment of public money. So the question is now, how do you combine those financial instruments with better resilience planning? And how do you do that to build in your long-term sustainability for the communities and build a better built environment for our infrastructure? So we designed a project which had sort of three parts to it. Policy, so what are the policies that we're going to require, whether that's social or physical? Just to bear in mind that we were talking a little about social equity earlier. After Hurricane Sandy, of the areas affected, 60% of the SMEs went out of business. It's those SMEs that drive the economy, and those SMEs are often in parts of the most disadvantaged communities. So we're looking at commercial opportunity too. You know, there's opportunities to do things better and to grow our economy on the back of it. And beyond our own communities, there's a really big developmental win here. The possibility to use what we learn here and take it into the emerging markets. So what we wanted to do was build economic resilience, transfer public sector risk into the private sector. And there are a lot of ways to do this. So this again comes from one of our infrastructure companies. If you can read it, good for you. It's going to, you don't need to listen to me from now on, you can just absorb that. But basically, our discussions focus primarily around the combination of raising money to invest in resilience, in other words, things like a classic municipal bond, and then covering that with an insurance policy, a catastrophe policy, if you like. It's a very simple idea. And what you do, if you take a resilience bond, or a municipal bond, say the Miami Forever bond, you insure that bond. And you insure it with a parametric insurance policy, which means that you set a trigger. If there's a storm surge of above 8 feet, if there's a sustained wind at point X of 140 miles an hour, whatever it is, you wrap the two together. The parametric insurance policy means that there are no costs of loss adjustment. You get the money if the criteria is met. That's it. So it's very quick to disperse. And all you do is you pay for that margin on the principal. If the disaster happens, then your principal is forgiven. You have the money. You can spend it on stabilization and recovery, whatever you want. If it doesn't, then it's a regular insurance policy. And it's cheaper than bundling those together than doing it separately. What it does is less vulnerable to fraud. It gives chief financial officers a better handle on the risk that they're willing to assume and the cost of that. And it gives politicians a tangible and quantitative demonstration about how much taxpayers' money will be invested in sustainability. So we're now at the stage where the market and its regulatory framework are in place. It's got sufficient confidence in modelling to price and transfer the risk. It's liquid and searching for high-risk, high-return opportunities. And cities and municipalities are at a stage where they have very inelastic fiscal circumstances. They've got rising liabilities, decaying infrastructure, and it means they need to raise money from elsewhere. They can't just do it themselves. So they're going to have to look at more innovative ways of doing it. If you add into that public opinion, and for example, the meeting only yesterday here in downtown Miami, we're beginning to see that political decision makers are going to be held accountable for their decisions. We've already seen legal cases in Belgium and Norway over flood defences. And I'm glad to see Philip here. Hasn't happened here yet, but this is a trend. You know, this is not a blip, this is a trend. And in the private sector, we're seeing the same thing. Those leading indicators are there. Companies are being evaluated on their resilience to catastrophic events in their portfolios. And that has a direct impact on their credit worthiness. You will have seen, or if you haven't seen, I'll tell you about it, the Harvard's recent study on Miami-Dade properties, which is saying that properties that were slightly higher in elevation were appreciating faster than those that were lower. You know, this is now happening. People are taking account of it. And there's one final piece of the jigsaw, and that's the development of a common narrative between business and government. And we've been talking a lot about that this morning, and it's absolutely the right thing to discuss. In the UK, business has recognised the cost of these vulnerabilities. Our FEMA equivalent, the Environment Agency, had come under a lot of criticism for not doing enough to prevent flooding. It has partnered with private sector companies around Oxford to build flood defences. The companies give the money, the Environment Agency plans and builds the defences. This isn't to protect the plant of those companies. They are car manufacturers. It's not to protect their factories. They don't flood. This is to protect the homes of their workers so that they can keep going to work during one of these big flood events. This is about business continuity, and the cost of around about 50 million into flood defences is a small price when you offset the cost against lost productivity from your workers being flooded out. This is now becoming sound business sense, and we in the UK are looking more at how we can leverage that private sector desire to keep that productiveness going to help actually the wider community. And that's why we've now got a global centre for disaster protection in London, which is really to look at best practice around the world and how you do these things. And what they're looking at now is how they can work out how investment in resilience can materially lower the cost of insurance cover in every year of an asset life. We've done a lot of work through our Caribbean territories in the wake of Irma. These are sometimes very difficult communities to access the capital markets. They find it hard. If we can lower that cost of access, thereby increase access to the finance, we can build back better. And it becomes easier to quantify the long-term benefits for the additional upfront costs of resilience. And this will encourage government to take on more risk ownership. And therefore, infrastructure financing should collateralise potential future losses from disasters, enabling savings from resilience to be realised up front for construction and to finance the longer lifespan of more resilient infrastructure. And this is something that the World Bank is already doing with the $1.36 billion cat bond that they've just issued, along with the 4 Pacific Alliance countries only a few weeks ago. So finally, you can see that we've been thinking hard about this in the UK, and I think the reason we wanted to do it here in Miami in the US, and we've had conversations now with Miami, with Boston, with DC, Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco, and Houston. And the answer has always been the same. We know that we can't go on as we are. We know that we can't keep relying on government to bail us out. Government is becoming more sensitive to that. It's becoming slower and harder. We have to take responsibility for this ourselves. And it's the vulnerability of our communities that is going to be driving that as our frequency of national hazard increases. So these are things we're looking at to build better, to build back better, to be more transparent about the real cost of resilience, and to use this to develop more sustainable method of pricing and building that into our communities for the future. Thank you very much.